Hi, everyone. My name's Emily, and I'll be co-hosting this session with Giulia. And we've got an awesome panel with more best practices because this was, there's a lot of stuff we wanted to cover that we didn't get to cover last time. So we wanted to get a whole new panel and just get some more perspectives in. So let's do a quick round of introductions and then we'll get started. Nat, do you want to start?
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Nat. I've been around chatbots, predominantly support chatbots, for scarily 9 years now, and that's been a range of telco and banking, and then more recently into software. Almost entirely visual bots rather than voice, and there is no question that I don't love to ponder or try and answer at least. And commonly we'll flip-flop between ideas. So that's me usually.
Sweet. I'm sorry if I butcher this, but Rômulo? Is that?
Yeah, that's great. And
okay.
and I mean, I know I'm the one meant. I'm the one with the interesting name. Hi everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm Rômulo. I'm a conversation designer based in Germany. I've been in this mad world for 3.5 years by now. I started doing voice control on smart home and on television, and have migrated in the last 1.5 years to a more of a call center automatization position. And I'm very happy to talk about this neat, weird world of conversation design with you guys today.
Thank you for being here. Tony?
Hi, Tony here. I am a former actor, turned exited online food ordering software company founder, like crazy transition. That's another story for another day. I spent about 4 years in the space. Previous consultant with Conversation Design Institute, worked with them through J&J, United Healthcare, a lot of healthcare regulated industries, NLU engineering, conversation design work, and I'm now a senior conversation designer at Vanguard.
Awesome. Grace?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Grace Hughes, based out of Dublin, Ireland. I have been in content design for probably about 8 or 9 years, conversation design more specifically for the last kind of 6 years. So I worked in one of Accenture's innovation hubs for a couple of years, focusing on how to design conversational interfaces. And now I'm leading an EMEA-wide team of experts in conversation design called the Conversation Design Hub. So yeah, really interested in this topic around best practice as it relates to conversation design, because I think it's super important. Yes, glad to see a few old friends in the panel. So great to be here and to meet some new ones. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I think we'll just get started with, you know what, let's start with personality. I think that's an interesting one, especially with GenAI, LLMs. And I was wondering if you have any best practices, or if the best practices have shifted with incorporating from like more traditional experiences to incorporating like GenAI, LLMs. And I guess what your thoughts are around that. Does anyone want to start?
To race to the mute button. I think we're it's maybe a cop-out answer, but I think we are all still navigating that, because in my experience, a hybrid, when we have a hybrid bot where it's a mixture of the traditional rule-based and the generative, you run the risk of having two halves of a bot, and you've got to ensure that shares the same personality. And part of that is boiling down what is personality to your bot, and what does that mean for your users. So I hope I mentioned in my intro, but most of my experience is on customer support bots, and that changes how your personality is used. And when you can boil those down, it's it's got to be able to be tailored to your use cases. In that, someone buying something shiny new, you can definitely flex that personality a bit more. And then for a generative, you've got a bit more wiggle room for it to kind of, I say do what it wants, but it might not be spot on, but you've got a bit more wiggle room, where you've got to then ensure any guardrails or protections are in place, as if that's a sensitive topic. Often happens in customer support. When you say personality traits like excitable, we don't want excitable on a sensitive topic. So then being able to translate that to your LLM to know what that literally means is super important. And I think this is why I think it might be the easy answer is that's so different depending on your sector and your individual organization. But it's being able to boil it down to its smallest parts. What does that mean? What is a personality? What traits does that include in your writing, or what the LLM generates?
Yeah, absolutely. Emil?
Yeah, and I think that's also a very interesting shift if we were working with rule-based bots and now with large language models, right? Because with rule-based bots, you had full control of the prompts. You were doing prompt design. If you wanted your bot to give a zinger here and there, you could place them very carefully. And when we're working with large language models, is okay, how can I prompt this or give enough examples that this is not overdone, right? So also like bring this kind of personality in this kind of technology is a little bit more challenging, actually, right? Because I mean, I know how the bot's supposed to sound in my mind, and I know that sometimes the bot, if, for example, the persona of the bot is a fox, then maybe this fox can give some like, I don't know, make some fox jokes here and there. But how do I prompt this? And the second thing is that I also see this a shift between different countries, so different markets. So I think that, for example, if we're coming from the US perspective, where voice is a little bit more part of the everyday thing of the everyday life, people might be a little bit more welcome to it. Whereas here in Germany, people are very conservative when talking to the chatbots, and they expect some kind, honestly, they expect the personality to be polite person number 4, you know, really to be very direct, very polite. Do you want this for every single bot? Do you really want, for example, that a bot that works for a soccer club, really not to be a football fan and not to like give you this excitement? From my perspective, that would be a great personality, right? But is this actually going to be faced in a positive way by the community, by the demographic that you're designing for?
I think what's really interesting as well on that point is a lot, if you look outside of maybe chatbots or voice assistants like we all might work on, is when you look at, for most people, when they're interacting with LLMs, so things like your co-pilots, your little assistants, they're often told in terms of how to use it. This is a tool, not a person or a being that you talk to. So then there's like this big question of, okay, so if it's a tool, does it need a personality, or does it just need to get the job done? And I think that's another part of it. And it might be back to what I said, is if your use case is so dependent, then your example about football, do I want to talk to someone about football if they don't care about football or can't talk to me about my favorite team? No. But if I'm reporting that you billed me incorrectly, I've got a real issue, do I care if your favorite football team is Man United? Probably not. And that's an extreme example. But
yeah, no,
Go ahead, Grace.
If I could just jump in here, I totally agree with what you both have just said, and I think the use case and the audience, the demographic is so important. I think that one example of a great use of personality multimodality that I often refer to is Clio. So this is like a budgeting assistant, and you can basically choose the type of personality that you want to help you with your budgeting. So it's really fun. You can choose like roast mode, which means, you know, you get a grilling if you spend too much. So really fun, like Gen Z audience. However, like I think that always the personality has to be in the service of the interaction goals. So on like a banking bot, for example, doesn't need to have like an over the top personality. So and humor needs to be really approached with caution. And if the bot is not helping you to get the job done, then those kind of wisecracks can actually, have the opposite of effect. So it is really hard, and I agree it's even harder now with large language models. But I would argue it's even more important because with the proliferation of these kinds of conversational experiences and how the content has been generated, there's a risk that these things all kind of sound the same and the experience is a little bit vanilla. So it's really a kind of a tightrope walk around getting the personality right, but not, going too far. So not easy, not an easy task, but important one.
So to yes and what everybody's saying here a little bit, the fact that we're asking the question is a great start, right? Because if you're not thinking about it and you're not assigning personality, you're not making intentional choices, well, then your user ends up assigning the personality for you. And that's not a position we want to be in, right? That's certainly the mindset that I had in an NOU world. As we move a little more towards generative stuff, we also don't want our technology dictating our personality, right? So whether it's the users or the technology, it's our responsibility to take on this job. So yeah, whatever your use case, be intentional.
And I spotted a question in the comments about like, what is a good prompt for this? And I would say, I don't know a boilerplate prompt, but in my experience, it's better to look at it from what do you not want it to do and reverse engineer from there. So what is in direct conflict with your personality that you at least partially define, and start there, because that is your absolute. So if your brand tone is friendly, casual, then an immediate aspect of your prompt is don't speak in a formal manner. Don't use words that are above a certain reading age. Don't use da-da-da. And that's a good place to start. Without knowing the depth of use case, though, you can't say what definitely to include, but you can decide what not to. And at least in my experience, that's a good place to work backwards from.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that can kind of apply in a broader sense when we think of the guardrails, like Nat's approach there. Like we sometimes, and I'm sure you guys have your own version of this, but we run like a kind of an unintended consequences workshop where we all come together and start and think, what's the worst that can happen? Which seems counterintuitive, but then that can actually kind of feed into your design principles then.
I would also add it's helpful to like put examples of like what you would want, potentially want or not want. So as specific as you can be within the prompt, I think is better. Giulia, do you have any?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna ask, since we've been talking about personality, about a slightly like corollary topic to that in terms of best practices, which is emojis. What are your thoughts on them? Like, do you have any best practices to know like when, if to use emojis?
So, I mean, I have seen that there's a study that says that people trust messages more when they have emojis, or it can boost it. But I think I haven't read the study in full. I've read that section, but I think that is so going to depend again on your context. And similar to what we said about personality overall is, and I think it's country and culture specific. They mean different things. So you've got to be so understanding of the culture that your bot is live in to know what alternative meanings those emojis might have that are not ones that you expect. And then if you're building trust, they've got to be used carefully. But if you think human to human, like, do we send emojis really commonly? Yes. Do we know that a thumbs up fairly universally? I'm open to someone telling me it means something different, but a thumbs up is often agreeing yes. So we've got some like universal ones, but then you get into this like layer below, which is, do I want to use the money bag emoji when I'm talking about a sale? But in the UK, that might indicate a dodgy deal. But it might be different in another country. But it's if you are like myself working on a bot that's across multiple cultures and cultures and countries as well, and languages, then you've got to really pick those universal ones as a starter. If it's one specific one, that might be easier based on your context of your user base.
I think I absolutely agree with you, Nat. I think I think also that like emojis can be really powerful tools to like back up the message that you're trying to send as well. So they are something that's powerful and really helpful that are available to us as conversation designers. But I totally agree. I mean, even within cultures, people have associate different meanings to emojis. For example, I thought like the high five emoji was actually like thank you or namaste for years until I found out otherwise. So there is that. But they definitely help if you're trying to go for a specific tone, for sure. I think it's like a lot of our responses, I think, are like, it depends, or like, approach with caution with some of these. I feel like that's how when I've been thinking about my responses, where I'm going.
Yeah, agree, Grace. It entirely depends upon your intended audience, right? Like in my past working in healthcare, this is an over 65 retired audience. I'm probably not going to send emojis. I think clear is kind. Ultimately, if your audience understands what you're trying to say, just check. Do you feel like that's what you're trying to say is clear? If it can be perceived as vague, it's probably not accessible, and you should probably not use it.
Another thing, just like placement of emojis too. It's really important to be careful with like screen readers, and because they do interrupt the flow if they're in the middle of the sentence. So sometimes it's just important to be aware of that, that it could like break up the meaning. It could do something different. Yeah.
And I was going to add, like, I don't know if anyone, a really practical is, I don't know if anyone's ever had a car system read out messages from a contact that has emojis in their name, and it will say person 1, man with hands in air, watermelon. And that's really frustrating in the middle of a sentence, and especially I'm thinking like healthcare, any customer support bot, when they're just trying to get help. If you've got a more fun bot, then I'm jealous. But if you've got a wider use case, but also like you can get away with that stuff a bit more. But it's really important that before anything, we're getting the job done before we even think about emojis and where they come into. And Tony put it beautifully about like being accessible to all. So I think it's really important.
And I think this opens up like a whole discussion on like what is the modality that we're talking about, right? Because like emoji is such a thing from written language, like from chatbots, as chat is the communication form that it might not translate at all to spoken language. So that's like maybe you need to have like 2 separate chatbots, or you have to have 2 different prompts on how the bot's supposed to act based on the medium. And I think it would also be interesting to also come back to something you've said, Nat, about, okay, what is the meaning behind the emoji, right? Because I mean, we can also try to, as you mentioned, assert a universal meaning to the emoji, but maybe if you're giving your user a list and each list ends with a different emoji, right? So if the person answers with a specific emoji from this list, maybe they're trying to say, oh, I want this option, right? How can you train an intent, for example, to say, okay, in this situation, this emoji means X and not Y?
Yeah, that's interesting, because then it gets like, so you have to get so detailed. You have to like think through all of the situations that you could be in that would require explanation. And yeah.
Imagine a confirmation prompt at the end of a purchase and somebody just throws you a thumb up. Thumbs up.
Yeah.
I was thinking a classic with bots is sarcasm is lost on chatbots of every type. So I remember seeing a thing about Gen Z thinking that thumbs up is what old people do or something like that. And so like if it's been a really frustrating experience and you're like, yeah, that was great, then actually a bot is going to take that face value. So yeah, there's a lot. Assigning a meaning, even in a practical sense, to your intents and that structure is so important of a consideration for that exact reason. Sarcasm,
Yeah,
not good for
absolutely.
bots.
And I think it extends kind of beyond emojis to the kind of tone that you apply, and whether you are kind of jubilant or congratulatory in your response to like a certain action that a user might take, because you're presuming you're presuming to understand the emotions they have in relation to that action. Like sending money, for example, this could be maybe not a joyful experience for them. So I think we have to be really careful when considering like our tone and how we respond to certain actions that the user takes.
Yeah, or like the sad emoji, sometimes to me it comes off like so tone deaf, like for something where you're like trying to show empathy and then you have sad emoji and it's like, oh, could you not use that right now, please?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. This got me thinking a little deeper about the cooperative principle of conversation, right? However I speak, the person will sort of speak in turn. We each take our turn and we speak and we use common language. We try and use common language. At least that's when conversation is best. If we're putting emojis out there, I expect them to send emojis back. And yeah, I know I kind of said that earlier, but gosh, that's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that actually segues perfectly into another question that we got. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the full context here, but I may broaden out. So the question is, how do you judge training tone of voice on opinions and possible advice? Do you even recommend doing that? Is my question. How much stridence and confidence, or does that depend on the brand?
I mean, I'll kick us off here, and I'm sure the rest of the panel have thoughts. Like I think that I would agree. Like I haven't been involved in a lot of projects where we're kind of giving the user advice on what action to take. It's more like, these are the steps that you need to take, and that's this is what you need to do, as opposed to like, here are a number of options, you should choose this one. But I can see that use case might come up. I think again, it depends on the motivation behind that advice, but and the brand. But my gut reaction is to opt for more of a neutral tone of voice, like just giving people the information as opposed to trying to like steer them in one way or the other. But again, it totally depends on the context, I guess. That they would be my initial thoughts.
Maybe. Yeah, like if you're doing that in a fixed response bot, like where you're predetermining your flows, much easier to get right. If then that is an LLM generated response that's giving any advice, you'd want to be really cautious on that kind of confidence given the nature. So is it going to be confidently wrong? We don't want that, but you can more easily inject that confidence if you are predetermining that. So it does also the brand, but the type of implementation of your bot as well.
Yeah, as Nat was saying, sometimes you run into, in a more regulated industry, you run into legal and compliance when you're trying to give out advice, right? So these things, you have an idea of what you want to present. It's in persona, you've had some copy review, but ultimately that has to get approved by legal and compliance. So that will be your safety net.
Yeah, I just find this so tricky, right? Because if we're talking about advice and opinions, like, first of all, is which direction are we going? Are we really talking about, like Grace mentioned, advice that is, oh, maybe you should do this in this order, or I think it would be a great option for you to buy X because it's cheaper? Or are we talking about like AI companions that, I don't know, they give a little bit more of an emotional advice, right? Advices in very complicated situations in life. And I think that this is, wow, that's really tricky, right? How can you navigate a use case like this using large language models and knowing that you are responsible for what your agent is saying? So it really goes back to what Grace was saying, really build some very strong guardrails, test a lot of bad things, because if something goes wrong, it's on your back. The target is on right here for you, right? So be very careful. Be very, very careful when dealing with such use cases.
Yeah, I also always think about like what kind of related to this. So I'm curious with personality and like tone of voice, like how much do you want to be flexible in like adapting to the user? Like if someone comes in and is like very like feels like the urgency and like putting pressure on you, like on the chatbot, like do you want to lean into that and say like be more like I don't know, accommodating because you hear the urgency in the tone, or do you want to stay like 100% focused on like the tone of voice that you establish and the persona you establish and like not steer away from that? Do you have maybe any thoughts on that?
I don't know if it directly answers it, but one is I really have a preference to, when in your design phase of mindsets over personas for your users for that exact reason. So if someone is confident with the technology, with chatbots generally, and they want things done fast, that's a different consideration in your process to maybe someone that's more of a cautious user, maybe a bit less trusting of these, maybe someone that might immediately say, can I get a person? Can I skip ahead, please? And it kind of, I think, again, I might be off on a slight tangent, but I think it's part of that consideration of personas are great, but actually mindset is really important in any interaction because that determines how you interact, certainly with conversational experiences. Because if I'm in a rush, I'm like, hey, tell me the answer right now. I've got to go. And a lot of people are the same.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I also think that in that case also, it's far more useful to think about like what options you're giving the user, i.e., can you make it easy for them to, if they have a problem that you cannot solve using the bot, make it easy for them to talk to a human. I know that's also a controversial topic, but it's more about the action that you allow the user to take in that instance than like a specific tone of voice that's like super apologetic, etc. It's the interaction that you allow. I think that's most important. But I also agree with mindsets as a really powerful design tool. That's a great reminder, Nat.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to remember that we have a job to be done in most cases. So it's one thing to come in with a really strong idea of persona and how we hope to present that job. But at the same time, if you and I were talking and you came in very urgent, like I would adjust. That's the nature of conversation. And this next generation of generative technology, it's part of the benefit, being able to lean into that, understanding what, not just what they want to do, but how they want to do it, and maybe having a little more flexibility in getting that job done.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the end of the day, we all want to talk to AI agents or chatbots that are empathetic in some kind of way, that they understand if we react in some kind of way that an answer comes that kind of like tries to keep us grounded and say like, hey, we're going to do this together. Just keep some turns with me. Just answer my questions. And I think just to end what you said, Tony, this is like where generative AI really shines, right? We don't need to think about every single case that our customers might need to be. We don't need to kind of like design a prompt when customers are happy. We design a prompt when customers are angry. Generative AI based on the text is very capable of adapting to the situation. So that's like a very, very compelling point to use generative AI in such cases.
Definitely. And I'm actually curious. I'm going to switch a little bit to best practices for chat versus voice. And do you have like different ways of approaching even writing the conversations and designing for chat and voice? And I guess, well, I'll leave it at that for now.
Sure. Yeah, as we get into voice and chat are very different for me. As we approach voice, we have a smaller cognitive window. I don't want to overwhelm my users, right? So if it takes me more than one breath to get out an idea of something I'm trying to accomplish, I better have a really good reason for doing that. Chat, it's a bit more self-paced. I still don't want to overwhelm the user, but there's a greater potential for them to just read, at their own pace. So that's certainly one of the strong ways to start. I want to always, whether it's voice or chat, let's reduce jargon, makes it more accessible. I'll leave there. I mean, there's a lot of things. I'm gonna leave some to everybody else.
I think I'm less experienced in voice, but I think it's really important to remember you have less aids at your disposal to get that information across. So the one breath example from Tony is perfect because you've always got a point of reference in chat, so you can scroll back, reread, see the options, digest them. There's a bit more time. It's a consideration in voice to make sure you're giving users that time as well. And we've all been through that old pain of 15 options and remembering which number to press back in, and so I think being able to chunk your information and certainly your decision points for users is really critical in voice, because if the average user is anything like me, we've got a goldfish level memory in terms of I've probably forgot what option one was already. So it's really important.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with my fellow panelists that yes, this cognitive window, which is a phrase I love, Tony, is a lot shorter. So those principles of concision and precision that we apply across all kinds of interfaces, we really need to double down on here. So I remember working on a voice UI project, and with my team, really kind of laboriously going through all of the prompts to ensure that we had cut back as much as we possibly could. So editing, cutting back is so important. But there are maybe a few little tricks that you can incorporate into, or tactics you can incorporate into the conversation design as well. Be ready for a user to say, "What was that?" And have a response available that paraphrases the description or the prompt, or be ready for the user to say, "Can you repeat that?" So there are a couple of things that you can kind of have in place to mitigate some of the challenges that come with voice user interfaces. But of course, there are so many benefits as well. So yeah,
I have found historically a good tactic for designers working on voice is I call it voice noting, and it's similar to just back-to-back testing if you're reading it out loud. But if you record your response to a bot, and then often if you listen to it back, there are a lot of, "Oh yeah, I did that on the what date was it? Oh, it was the 24th of March." And there's a lot of and you practically can hear it when you just record it and listen back even to a set of voice notes. So I've always referred to it as the voice note method, and and that's more similar to how we all really speak. And well, just then, perfect example. I'm an I'll say all the time, and that's really important to cater for and to ignore certain aspects of, especially when you're intent matching or trying to get to the root of a question.
And I think it's also very important to play to the strengths of the modality that you're designing for. Like if you're designing for voice, the thing that you complain the most is that, oh, everything needs to be so short. I can't have any structure. And then when you work with chat, you can have that, right? You can have lists. Oh my God, what a beautiful thing, right? Helps organize the information. People can see stuff in a glance. But translating these lists into spoken language, you kind of like need to think, okay, how am I gonna read a list like this out loud? But on the other hand, when you're designing a spoken conversation, you can also think that a little bit or more on the collaborative principle, right? That you that the agent is going to try to talk to the caller and try to find out together what actually the issue is about or what is the best option for the caller. So, I mean, at the end of the day, as Tony mentioned, right, designing for chat and designing for voice, there is a very similar background to that, but it's very different, right? It doesn't mean that your experience translates one to one, but as good conversation designers that we are, I am pretty sure that we can play on our strengths to know and see the differences between the modalities.
So I'm gonna bring in another question. There's another one about industry standard tools, but I think we'll just get to that one in the chat. How do you see personalization of the chatbot experience and privacy data sharing regulations? I know this can get a bit tricky with like GenAI and LLMs, but just curious if you have any thoughts on this.
I don't know necessarily if it's if I have a good example specific enough to chatbot experiences, but I think as long as there is a level of transparency with your users about what you're doing, it's not too dissimilar to any personalized experience. I think if it's depending on regulations in certain areas of the world, but you might have to literally ask your user to agree to it, or it might be implied when you start that interaction. I think as long as they have access to how you're using it and why in some form, I think it's not too dissimilar than any other digital experience in that sense. We get into a murkier world where I don't have the answer about what level of personalization from the way that you structure sentences and what does that imply and what does your gender feed into it and then that sort of thing. I don't have an answer for that part, but I think in terms of personalizing it through data, it's not too dissimilar to anything else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it would be very weird if I call somewhere and then they're like, oh, hey, Rômulo, how are you doing? Like, well, wait, why do you know who I am? But if the agent or if the bot then tells me, hey, I've just checked your data, it looks like your client, then I know what actually is happening, where this data is coming from, this transparency, which you just mentioned, that this is then created, then I can understand that, yeah, of course, they might have my data because that's the telephone number that they have registered, right? So I think that we can then really use this data without having like a bad feeling or a heavy conscience, right? Especially if this data is being used to make the experience faster and much nicer to our customers, right? Because if I have already the possibility to pull their data and I don't have to ask them for an email address or ask them for an address or something like this, then why shouldn't I do it, right? This is the benefit for my client because they don't need to give me this information. Is also a benefit for me because I have this information already ahead in the format that I need. So all smiles all around.
And like a principle in bots that I found generally is don't ask people for data that you have because you're just adding extra friction. And then that is very contextual. If I'm in a logged in experience and I'm accessing my bot, I'm expecting that you will know. And actually the bot is doing a disservice if it doesn't know those things about me if I'm logged in. So yeah, I think if I was talking about kind of best practice such principles, when we want to reduce friction in experience, that access to data and personalization is really important, but always boils back down to the why. Why are we doing it? Let's not use data for the sake of it. It's got to, and this is the same thing for using LLMs generally, it's got to serve a purpose and it's got to meet the need and use it with care.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think like there's nothing more frustrating than having to supply information that you've already supplied. And I think what organizations really need to think about is this idea that a colleague in Accenture Song mentioned a couple of years ago to me, and it kind of stuck with me, that idea of like the complexity tax that we can, you know, unintentionally pass on to our users because of the level of complexity around the channels that we're using, how data is stored, and also like silos within the organization. So we need to work as much as we can behind the scenes in the backstage to ensure we don't pass that complexity on to the user. We don't make them jump through hoops and resupply information where we could have actually caught that and given them a smoother, frictionless experience, as you say, Nat. So it's kind of a broader topic, but I think, you know, that's something that's difficult to address, but we need to think about.
Yeah,
And I think, sorry, Tony, go.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, and that's on us to advocate within
Yeah.
our organizations, advocating to product, advocating to our engineering teams who just say, you know, put the ones where the ones go and the zeros where the zeros go. Like, we need to be thinking about that user experience, and we need to be advocating for them at every turn. And, you know, these are those friction points where users drop off and users have bad experiences where we can really make a difference, right? If I'm ordering from my favorite restaurant, maybe I don't mind that they say, hey, do you just want the usual? We see that you order the same thing all the time. That sounds like a great use case. So if you're elevating their experience by using their data and you're doing it in a way that's legal and ethical, by all means, go for it.
And yeah, one bit of practical advice to any conversation designers out there is that we are in it's like a gold mine, bots are, because instead of needing to go and do a set of research that has a fixed time scale and we talk about it and then we come back with a hypothesis, you have daily, hourly, minutes data constantly, and your users are telling you what they need constantly. So it's beneficial for your organization to share that where you learn it, because actually some of those things, as Grace and Tony have said, like, it's almost like a complexity tax. I'll steal that phrase from you, Grace, but that's not the customer or user's problem that we do that, but we can help to improve it because we are at the front door of them telling us about it. And I think use that is the obvious part, but then as well, I've always called it, like, I'll refer to it as the curse of knowledge. And actually, if you know an organization and you know how these processes work, and behind the scenes you're saying, yeah, but that doesn't work that well, and actually the error message we show is really confusing, then you don't have to design your conversations around that, because you know that as far as the user's concerned, that doesn't happen, and you need to help them navigate around that. And same of if it's about your products. You are not your user is the common thing to say, but you are cursed by knowing too much in some aspects. So boil it back down to, if I knew nothing about my company and I ask this question, does it mean the same thing to a customer as it does to me, knowing what happens in our back-end systems and backstage? So I think they're like really linked there.
Yeah, and that gets back to like meeting your customer where they are, right? Not expecting them to come to your level, because that's completely unreasonable. Like you're saying, you the curse of knowledge. You know everything about this experience, and you make certain assumptions because we see it every day. But we really need to bring that level down to where they're entering the front door for the first time.
And at the end of the day, this is all design methodology, right? So one of the things is like putting yourself into your customer's point of view, like creating a user journey, see what are they thinking? Are they going to get frustrated because of this? And on the other part is, of course, as designers, we are designing based on hypotheses, right? So sometimes we have time to test stuff out, do A/B tests, know based on results which alternative is better. Sometimes we're not. And that's why especially this hypercare phase, or this monitoring of the chatbot, how it's going throughout the time, is so important. Because as you mentioned, that clients are literally telling you what they want, how they want to interact with the product that you're bringing out. So it is definitely our duty to remind all the stakeholders for the 9th time, this is an iterative process. I can't bring the perfect bot on the first try. It doesn't matter how experienced I am, because I am not the customer. I'm a very primed person, actually.
Yeah, it's so true. And that like that can be a challenge, you know, to a challenging message to get across, that like there is no way it's going to be perfect when it launches. There's an evolution that needs to happen over time that will never end, probably, because we can always improve the experience. And I think that's a bit of an education that we need to bring our stakeholders along.
Yeah. And go ahead, Giulia.
No, I was just gonna bring up quickly this comment about emojis, like that links to what you were saying, Emily. On some of them also have names that run 5 or 6 words long, which obviously gets tedious for listeners. So just something else to add about emojis there.
And Guillermo also has a question, and then we'll get to another question about testing. How would you design a chat conversation that users may need to wait for a long time on queue? I'm actually curious about the context, because like, I'm curious if that's like waiting for information or like latency maybe, or if
So
maybe
handing
over to.
Hand over.
Yeah.
Guillermo, I'm going to go from the perspective that you're talking about, the handing over. I think this would be a prime position to add a callback function to the chatbot. There is nothing that I hate more than waiting in a line with this music in the background and then waiting at every second for someone to just start talking to me. So whenever any hotline offers me, hey, we can call you back, we already got all of your information, so you're good to go once we call you. To me, that's great, right? I mean, then it becomes the question, like, when that's not possible, maybe out of the scope, it really can't be done. This is difficult. I think that maybe be transparent about it. Don't make people think like, oh, it's going to be a quick ride. Because I think that if people know what's going to come, right, we are managing the expectations from our customers here, and maybe they will be already in a better mood to maybe put their cell phone down and put them on the loudspeaker so that they can focus on something else and not take a look at the cell phone the whole time.
I think a really practical part is as well, if that callback function is not possible in your organization, and it might not be, there might be a higher cost for callback, it might not technically be feasible. But in that scenario, if you're handing over to a human advisor from the chatbot, is what can you do to help the other side of that conversation once you're there? Can you authenticate them ahead of time? Saves them some time. We know that that's quite a slow thing over chat. Or can you make sure you summarize what you've already talked about with the user for the advisor to help them understand what the customer needs and how they can solve it? And then you could get into the really advanced stuff of, is there something the bot could do to surface it for your advisors so they have an answer ready? It's how far do you want to go with it? But I think it's all about making it easier.
So sorry, just posted again. The posted show for some reason, but you had to wait 43 minutes to talk to an agent on chat.
Oh no.
I didn't miss that post. I knew exactly
okay.
what. Back on LinkedIn, I saw it. It's wild. Yeah, the dialogue. Y'all go back and check that out. It's pretty wild what people have been through.
Sorry, we sometimes stuff gets missed with the
Oh yeah, there was nothing here. He's talking external, but I like to go back to the Domino's pizza tracker. Like, there's so much information there. You know everything about your pizza, where it is in the process. Man, they're really good. I just think, give information where it's relevant and helpful. If you're 43rd in line, maybe put that at the bottom of the chat window, right? So it's and a guesstimation based on typical handle time, about how long, and let that refresh so that you can come back in and check. But yeah, or just take your business elsewhere. 43 minutes is stupid.
Be very ready for a user to mindset to change if you tell them it's, hey, you're waiting an hour, or you're position 120 in the queue. We've all been there in some form or another, and your mood, your mindset changes. So then back to make sure you are doing something helpful if you can ahead of time. That's if nothing else is possible, that's the only kind of middle ground you're going to get to try and help the customer ultimately.
Is there some way to surprise and delight someone that has to be on hold for 43 minutes? Could you have like click this link to play a game in the next browser and just acknowledge how absurd something like that is?
Like when Chrome is offline, that you can click the little dinosaur there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that's where this example here that Guilherme shared, that's where being transparent and upfront is going to help the user, and it clearly didn't happen here. So, yeah, cat videos. I'm thinking.
There's an open point about like artificial timings sometimes. So sometimes an artificial pause helps a user know that you've done the thing, because if it's too fast, they don't trust it. But then in the case of this, where it's the opposite, where things are too long, like is the illusion of progress enough to keep someone okay, or do we need to tell them, and it's an open question about that transparency. What level of transparency do we give? Because exactly what I was just saying, if you're really honest, you say, yep, it's 2.5 hours until you chat to someone. Well, they're just going to disconnect, but you put it in their hands, I guess. But it's like an open thought.
At least you're telling them and giving them, setting expectations up front so they can do what they want with it. We do have one question about testing that I think is actually going to be very useful. What are ways we can test agents and AI chatbots other than the Wizard of Oz method, as they have unpredictable responses sometimes? So
I wish I had the perfect answer for this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wish I had the perfect answer for this, but I think it's something I'm certainly working through of, like, now in this world where we have access to generated answers, how are we effectively testing them? If you can, we've had loads of success with kind of your subject matter experts testing at scale. So that is sometimes a frontline advisor, but that's not always applicable to every organization either. But we really rely on those experts, because especially people that talk to customers every day, because they know how they communicate, they know how to answer those questions. And I've always referred to them as almost like a translator, like they are the bridge for our bot to understand beyond just intents. It's like that double meaning of what some questions. So I don't have a better solution to advise just yet, but that in my experience has been a good middle ground.
I think like one thing that can help make testing a little smoother is where you have a separate, design and technology team, that you've a really, really good working relationship between the two. So they're aware of what's happening at the design phase. You're talking frequently. They understand the vision, and that you have that relationship before you get to the testing point, when things are inevitably gonna appear that we didn't expect or want. But this is not directly answering the question, but like, however you test, I think that it might seem obvious, but it doesn't always happen. I think that strong relationship between the two teams is so important, and a kind of a presence from the design team also, throughout the process as we move towards development is key, I think.
Sorry. So I'm thinking, if depending on your organization, right? Like, it depends where you're coming from. If you're building a Gen AI bot out of nothing and nothing to back it up, you don't have the data to support assumptions, you probably need a lot more testing. If you have an existing deterministic, NLU style bot, you probably have a lot of user data, and they have expectations, regardless of the technology that you're putting in front of them. They have a typical way, they have a job to be done, and they have, typical ways of interacting with you, and you can use those to test a smaller subset of, potential user experiences. So I think that can be helpful. So it's really context dependent for your organization.
Yeah, I can heavily corroborate on that. If you're like doing some kind of transition of the chatbot, right? Before you were using NAU and now you're using some kind of LLM, then your client is probably still expecting that those cases from the NAU bot are still being handled by the LLM bot. So that's a prime starting ground for some testing case. Maybe the tool you're working with also allows you to run like simulations and stuff like this, which you can then evaluate. And depending on the organization, on the structure, I'm a very shameless person. I just go to people and say like, call my bot and test it. Sometimes with some kind of background, sometimes with nothing. Just like take a look. How would you interact with this? And to me, it was always very useful if I had two demographics testing my bot, if there were other conversation designers testing my bot, because of course, I mean, they know how a chatbot's supposed to work. They probably know what they're supposed to say, but they're also going to test stuff like, oh, how does the timeout work? Which probably my normal user is not going to do. So that's very useful information. And sometimes we would just like stand in the hallway in front of a door, and everyone that would pass by would say like, hey, do you have 3 minutes? Can you test something? And then we would also get like some people that still worked at the same company didn't really have context of what we were doing in specific. So they would act a little bit more user-like. So it goes a little bit more in the direction of a friendly user test. This is, of course, like the question, can you have this structure, right? Can you have a bot that you can go live for a friendly user test? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So if you're really talking about the prototype level, is what you mentioned, like Wizard of Oz, is some of that. But I read in a book, and I want to say that it wasn't Kathy Pearl, but I'm not really sure. So basically, what you're doing, it's like you're live with the test person, but you're like hidden from them, and then you're kind of like doing this conversation live, right? And I think that the point that you mentioned, like, okay, sometimes my user goes in another direction, which my bot wouldn't be able to follow. What a great opportunity, right? Because then you can test the repair mechanism that you have designed for your bot. How is that actually helping the user or not?
Yeah, for sure. I also see some questions exactly on that, like a question exactly on that, like what are some best practices around recovering from picking back up after a chat experience is interrupted by a network issue or something like that?
I keep coming back to it being partially dependent on what your tools are capable of, right? So that's a conversation to have with your engineers, right? If you have all the tagging and you have all the data from the conversation leading up to that point secure, and you pick it back up and you can just recall that instantly, it creates a different experience than if you have to start from nothing. That's all I have to offer.
And I think like thinking specifically about the tone, it will depend on the personality that you've designed for the bot as well. So you will have considered ahead of time how apologetic you want to be and how you want to approach error handling. So that should be something that has been, thought about and considered ahead of time. So, it might be better to like apologize. That's fine if that's the decision you've made, but then move quickly to pick up the conversation again, as opposed to getting into effusive apologies.
There's one. Does anyone else have anything to add around this? Okay. There's one more comment just from the last one from testing that I want to just bring up, just so people have this information. From Costas, what we use for testing is LLM-powered automatic scenario testers, which actually verify if an answer contains all the kind of information that's expected that is the expected answer independently of the dynamic values included in the answer, and it works for us. So that's another way, I guess, you can approach that.
Yeah,
and I
that's
think
also my experience.
Yeah,
okay.
Very dependent on your company's risk appetite, because
Yes.
are you happy with that being the test? In regulated industries, that might not be enough. It might be that you need manual review. I'm not saying of every single one, but at least And I always think human in the loop is always going to drive better outcomes and better and drive your backlog of improvements in a much better way. But you know, when you've got a huge amount of volume of chats, yeah, absolutely. But it is going to depend on your particular risk appetite.
And I think this is in no way a substitute for human testing, because actually at the end of the day we can test different things, right? The problem is sometimes with chatbots that you create via large language models that they are not as consistent as an NAU bot. So if you're trying to test 1,000 scenarios to see if your bot performs well in the 1,000 scenarios, maybe you don't want to do this by hand, right? But yeah, really, it really depends what you're gonna try to test. But yeah, human testing, it's still the alpha and the omega.
Yeah, and then I guess, you know, there's a lot of talk about kind of a hybrid approach where we have, you know, some intents or use cases where we leverage a large language model, but some are more deterministic. So maybe it's a case of like looking at use cases where the risk is relatively, you know, lower. We can take on that approach. This is kind of broader than testing, I guess, but I think this appetite for risk kind of feeds into the conversation around a hybrid approach as well, which I think is an interesting one to have.
Absolutely. And I know we're at time. Do you all have time for one more question? Or okay. Yeah, this is an interesting one. And I know we could get into a huge discussion about this, but just wanted to get to it. This is the last one we have, and then we can close out. But any tips on how to design and document a balance between the long tail scope-related benefits of GenAI while providing more structured, thoughtfully designed responses for key flows, especially when developers are pushing for a pure plain text prose approach that's easier to implement?
Digesting the question, but also to developers, it's user first. So what do our users need? If there is some literal restrictions where we can only show that, fine. But if I'm following the question, so where GenAI might be better, and I think unless I'm off, is it from Stephanie? Yeah. If I'm off, then it relates to that hybrid approach of, like, I always look at it of what are the bits that GenAI does really well, and that is sometimes it's the buffer around your answer. So it's the clarifying the input, making sure we get to the right place. Then your response could be fixed, and then you could back end it with more of a generative approach, which is like you kind of those natural bits of finishing up your conversation. Also, then back to the previous question, which is a bit lower risk there, because if it's a sort of refining and sort of conversation ending tool, might be a bit less risk, certainly if there's less chance of getting the answer wrong. There's a really nice example from Nibble, I think that was on Parse last year, where they do an atomic approach about it, and I think that fits into what you're talking about, Steph. But yeah, apologies if I was waffling there. I was half digesting it in half.
No, it's a tough one to, yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, please go first.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just recalling that talk from Nibble with the atomic approach, and I think it was a really great example of the kind of the evolution of let's just throw everything at the model kind of approach at the beginning to actually know we need to go for something that's more hybrid, and orchestrate this in different ways to restrict the conversation. It's so kind of like traditional conversation design, deterministic conversation design. I think we don't need to throw it away. There are definitely cases where having that level of restriction is helpful, but then, you know, creating this approach that brings in the benefits of LLMs as well. Sorry, you were gonna jump in, Romeo.
Yeah, but that's great. What I actually wanted to say is something a little bit different. I think that if we have any developers listening to us right now, shame on you. Like, the easier to implement is the worst answer possible. And the second thing is also circling back to what Emily has said in the beginning, as we were talking about, as we're talking about the persona, the personality of the bot, and how they use language and so on. It's very dependent also on what technology you're using, if there's something that allows this hybrid approach or not. But working with like large language model only agents has really taught me about using examples, because examples, they are a catch-22 basically. So if you use examples, the model really likes examples, but really likes examples. So it's gonna be very tempted to always use the examples that you give. But this also gives you the opportunity to ground your conversation in certain points where you can then say, okay, so in this point, you really need to act empathetic. Here's an example. If you want some variance in the prompt that is generated, you have still some options, like some prompting techniques. For example, you can use placeholders and so on. So yes, we still have the trade-off examples, but examples are really there to be used as a tool, not only to lock some kind of specific formulation into place, but also to lock some kind of behavior.
I don't have anything specific to share. I just wanted to call out that Stephanie Reimer is awesome, and she's a friend, and I like her a lot because she's good people. That's it.
Yes. Agreed. I know we're like way over time, but I just wanted to thank you all so much for being here. This was so insightful, so useful, so helpful. And yeah, I just really appreciate it. So
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, stay tuned. We have more panels coming up. So
yeah, always around for a conversation about conversations. So
yes. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.